You've brought us some seriously fascinating stuff to dive into today. Articles, research, all exploring, well, the kind of tough stuff that a lot of couples go through, right? That feeling of drifting apart emotionally, the pride that can get in the way, and gosh, the lack of empathy that can really sting.
Absolutely. And, what strikes me right away, even from just glancing at the intros of these sources, is how intertwined these issues are. You don't get one without the others, right? Emotional isolation, that stubborn pride, and the lack of empathy, they feed each other. And before you know it, you've got these negative cycles kind of digging themselves deeper and deeper.
It really is like that. You see it happen all the time, almost a domino effect. One person starts to pull back, withdraw emotionally, and, well, the other person probably feels pretty rejected, so maybe they put up a wall,
Hmm.
get a little too proud to show they're hurting. And that just makes the first person feel even more alone, and the ability to see things from the other's perspective, to have empathy, it kind of fades away. Breaking that cycle, oof, that's a whole other challenge, isn't it?
It is, and it's something that requires a lot of, well, I guess you could say a lot of untangling.
Exactly. So let's get into it. Let's untangle it. In this deep dive, we're going to get specific, really unpack each of these challenges. What does the research tell us about what they actually are? What causes them in relationships? What damage do they do? And most importantly, how do we shift these dynamics? What are the approaches, the strategies to actually offer a path forward?
Well, I think a good place to start might be with that emotional isolation, that withdrawal we see in couples. The way your sources describe it, and I think it's spot on, is like a state of, well, emotional separation, different from just being lonely or even choosing to be alone. This is about an inability or maybe an unwillingness to really share those deep parts of yourself with your partner.
And you see it in how people act,
Yeah.
right? Like the sources pointed out some pretty clear signs. One partner might just shut down during any kind of discussion, or they, actively dodge those big conversations about feelings or what's going on in the relationship. And sometimes it's not even that dramatic. It's just, the little things,
Mm.
not sharing those everyday moments, the feelings, the ups and downs,
Mm.
or even just, being hesitant to show affection, being kind of guarded.
It's like that initial instinct to protect yourself, by pulling back, it backfires. It becomes the very thing that, well, that destroys the connection you're trying to protect.
Yeah, it's like that saying, the best defense is a good offense.
Correct.
Except here, the defense is actually what sinks the ship. And it's so interesting when you start to look at, I guess, the psychology behind it. Right? Why do people do this?
Well, attachment theory comes up a lot here. Makes a lot of sense, right?
Mhm.
Particularly those insecure attachment styles, that avoidance style, really stands out. Think about it. If someone grows up with caregivers who, well, they weren't emotionally available, maybe they were even critical a lot of the time, that can have a huge impact, right? It's understandable that someone might grow up to be, well, afraid of intimacy. It becomes like this learned way to keep yourself safe.
Yeah, and it makes sense. It's like your brain learns, hey, emotional needs, don't expect them to be met.
Yeah.
Better to push people away before they let you down.
Exactly. And it's not always about childhood either. Some people have tough experiences later on, bad breakup, some kind of abuse, unresolved grief, even just long periods where their emotional needs weren't met. It can all reinforce that fear, make those avoidance patterns stronger. Some of the sources even talk about links to personality stuff,
Mm.
things like avoidant personality disorder.
Avoidant personality disorder. Wow. And then there was this other term that I'd never really thought about before, anaffectivity.
Right, and affectivity. It's basically this, well, difficulty experiencing or expressing emotions. Not that they don't have feelings, it's more like they have trouble processing them or letting others see them. And, something else that's really fascinating is this idea of childhood emotional parentification. Basically, it's when, well, a child ends up taking on the role of the emotional caretaker for their parents or even their siblings. That can really mess with their ability to form those healthy, balanced relationships later in life.
It's like they never really got to be a kid, emotionally
Oh.
speaking. They were too busy taking care of everyone else. So I guess the big question is, what does all this emotional isolation, what does it do to a relationship? What are the consequences?
Well, let's be honest, it's rarely pretty. Think about it from the other partner's perspective. They're on the receiving end of this isolation. They probably feel rejected, frustrated, like they're invisible. And lonely, really lonely, even when they're physically with their partner. Communication, forget about it. It either completely falls apart or becomes super superficial, just practical stuff, no real emotional depth. Intimacy takes a nosedive too, both physically and emotionally. and conflicts. They don't get resolved. They just fester and create more and more tension.
It really paints a bleak picture, doesn't it?
Yeah.
A relationship slowly becoming, well, as the sources put it, an empty shell.
It is. It really is. And you know what's so ironic is that this isolation often starts as a way to protect yourself, right? Like, I'll withdraw to avoid getting hurt. But it ends up creating the very thing you were afraid of in the first place. Disconnection.
So much for the best defense being a good offense, huh? Like that fear of being disconnected actually leads you to act in ways that, well, that guarantee you'll end up disconnected.
And the impact on both people is huge. The person isolating themselves might end up feeling even more lonely, might even get depressed. And the other partner, they're left feeling constantly rejected and frustrated. It's a lose-lose.
A lose-lose, definitely. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. Talk about something else that can really damage a relationship. Pride. But the sources were pretty careful to make a distinction, right, between, like, healthy pride and this other kind, this
hubristic pride, or, dysfunctional pride. It's the kind that's really problematic.
Right, dysfunctional pride. So what's the difference?
Well, think about it like this. Authentic pride, healthy pride, comes from, real achievements, working hard, mastering a skill, those moments where you're like, yeah, I did good, I'm proud of myself. It comes with a healthy self-esteem. But hubristic pride, the dysfunctional kind, is all about arrogance, feeling superior to others, even when there's no real basis for it. It's often tied to narcissistic tendencies.
Oh, I see. And there was that table in the sources that really laid it out. Table 1, I think it was. Really helpful to see the contrast, side by side.
Oh, yeah. That table is great. Really sums it up well.
Yeah. So let's say you've got a couple, and one person is, well, they're struggling with this dysfunctional pride. How does it show up? What are the, the warning signs?
Lots of ways, actually. Someone with this kind of pride, they'll rarely admit they're wrong. Apologies. Forget about it. Compromise. Out of the question. It's their way or the highway, because they're always right. They get offended easily by their partner's opinions, even, well-intentioned feedback, and they usually react defensively.
Oh, I know that type. Always got to be right.
Exactly. And they'll almost always blame their partner for any problems in the relationship. Zero accountability. And that blame often turns into, criticism. Putting their partner down, making sarcastic comments, using, manipulative tactics like the silent treatment. In some cases, it can even get into gaslighting territory.
Gaslighting, that's pretty serious. It's all about control, isn't it? Making the other person doubt their own reality. And, I think this really gets to the heart of why this kind of pride is so damaging in a relationship. It creates this imbalance of power.
Absolutely. It's not about equality or mutual respect. It's about one person needing to be on top all the time. So the big question is, where does this come from? What creates this kind of this dysfunctional pride?
Yeah, what's the psychology behind it?
Well, a lot of it goes back to, to self-esteem or a lack of it, that arrogance, that constant need to feel superior.
Yeah.
It's often covering up deeper feelings of inadequacy, shame, insecurity, stuff they might not even be aware of.
So they're basically overcompensating, right?
Yeah.
Putting on this big show to hide how insecure they really are.
Exactly. And, childhood experiences can play a role, too. Think about it. If a kid gets praised constantly, told they're perfect all the time, they might grow up with this inability to accept their flaws, admit they made a mistake. On the flip side, if a child experiences a lot of rejection, humiliation, constant criticism, they might develop these really rigid defenses to protect themselves.
It makes you wonder how much of our adult behavior is shaped by how we were treated as kids.
It's a huge factor. We learn so much about ourselves and how to relate to others in those early years.
So let's say this dysfunctional pride takes root in a relationship. What happens?
Doesn't take a genius to see that it's going to cause problems. Big problems. For starters, intimacy goes out the window, both emotional and physical. Real intimacy requires vulnerability, and if you're wrapped up in this pride, vulnerability feels dangerous. You can't let your guard down. Communication, forget about it. It becomes all about criticism, defensiveness, not really listening or trying to understand each other's perspective. Conflicts escalate quickly and rarely get resolved because, admitting fault feels like a personal attack.
So it's this vicious cycle of defensiveness, blame, and just not being able to connect on a real level. What a nightmare.
It really is. And for the partner on the receiving end, they're probably feeling constantly devalued, misunderstood, controlled even. Over time, trust gets chipped away, they disconnect emotionally, and the relationship suffers. The research actually backs this up. There's a clear link between this hubristic pride, increased aggression in relationships, and, just plain unhappiness. Both partners end up miserable.
So to be clear, this arrogant superior act, it's not actually a sign of strength. It's more like
It's a mask, a way to hide their insecurity and fragility.
a mask. Makes sense.
Right.
It explains why even the smallest criticism can set them off, right?
Exactly. Because, deep down, they need to feel superior, to be right all the time. They can't handle any sign of weakness, even in themselves. It's all tied to that fear of being seen as, flawed or unlovable.
Wow. So if you're a therapist working with a couple like this, I imagine it's tempting to just, call out the pride, try to confront it head on.
Yeah.
But that probably backfires, right?
It does, makes them dig in their heels even more. A better approach, a more compassionate one, is to help them explore those vulnerabilities they're so scared of. Create a safe space where they can start to understand those deeper fears, the insecurities driving that pride.
It's about helping them build real self-esteem, right? Not the fake kind that comes from putting others down.
Right. Help them see their worth comes from within, from their values, their actions, not from needing to be better than everyone else. As they become more comfortable with vulnerability, that need for the mask, the pride, it starts to fade away. And that opens the door for real connection.
Okay, so we've talked about isolation, we've talked about pride. Now let's get to the third piece of the puzzle here, empathy, or should I say the lack of it. Now, empathy gets thrown around a lot, but your sources were pretty specific about, well, about what it actually means, breaking it down.
Yeah, it's more than just a feeling. It's got layers.
Yeah. So what are those layers? How is empathy actually defined?
Basically, empathy is the ability to understand and share in another person's emotions and perspective, to really get where they're coming from, to feel what they're feeling, and to be motivated to help if they're struggling. Now, it's not just a single thing, it's got different components to it. You've got cognitive empathy, that's like the intellectual side of it, being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand their thoughts and feelings. Then there's affective empathy, the emotional part. It's like when you see someone who's sad, you actually feel a little sad yourself.
So cognitive is the head, affective is the heart.
That's a good way to put it. And then building on both of those, you've got compassionate empathy. This is where you're not just understanding and feeling with someone, but you're also moved to actually do something, to help them in some way.
So it's not enough to just understand, you also have to care.
Right, exactly. Now, one important thing to remember is that with empathy, you got to keep a healthy boundary between your own emotions and the other person's. Otherwise, it can become this messy, overwhelming thing where you lose yourself in their feelings.
That makes sense. Healthy boundaries are important in every relationship, right? So let's talk about what it looks like when empathy is missing. If you're in a relationship where one partner isn't very empathetic, what does that feel like?
Well, it can show up in a lot of different ways, but it usually boils down to the other person feeling dismissed, invalidated, or just plain misunderstood. You might hear things like, oh, it's not a big deal, or you're too sensitive, that kind of minimizing talk. Or they might get criticized for how they're feeling, told they shouldn't be upset, or that they're overreacting.
It's got to be so frustrating to have your feelings just brushed aside like that.
It is. And in some cases, it can even get to the point where they're blamed for their own struggles, like, you brought this on yourself, or you're always making a big deal out of nothing. And when they try to open up, be vulnerable, they might get met with awkward silence, a subject change, or even jokes that make light of the situation.
Wow, that sounds incredibly lonely. To be in a relationship and feel so unheard and alone.
It really is. A big part of it is that the person who lacks empathy often just doesn't get how their actions impact their partner. They might do something hurtful and be completely oblivious to the pain they caused. And that goes hand in hand with a lack of concern for their partner's overall well-being, their needs, their happiness.
So what causes this? Why do some people struggle so much with empathy?
Well, the sources pointed to a bunch of different things. Sometimes it's linked to personality disorders. Those cluster B disorders like narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder. Those can all involve difficulties with empathy.
And how does that work? How do those disorders affect empathy?
Well, it depends on the specific disorder, but generally speaking, they can mess with both the cognitive and affective components of empathy. For example, someone with narcissistic traits might be really good at understanding what makes people tick, for their own manipulative purposes, but they don't actually care about the other person's feelings. And then, you've got psychopathy, which is like the extreme end of the spectrum. Very little to no empathy. And that can be dangerous because it often goes along with the lack of remorse and a tendency to manipulate and exploit others.
That's scary stuff. So What else can contribute to these empathy deficits?
Well, the sources talked about this condition called alexithymia. It's interesting because it's not about lacking empathy for others. It's actually about having trouble identifying and expressing your own emotions. So it makes sense that if you struggle to understand your own feelings, it'll be harder to tune into other people's emotions.
Right, you got to have some awareness of your own inner world to really get what's going on in someone else's.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the whole nature versus nurture debate. Childhood experiences play a big role. If you grow up with parents who weren't very empathetic, who were emotionally distant or neglectful, well, you're less likely to develop those skills yourself.
It's like if you never saw empathy modeled, how would you know how to do it?
Right. And it's not just about the big stuff either. Even smaller things like being socially isolated as a kid can impact how well you develop empathy. And then there's the general level of emotional awareness and intelligence. Some people are just naturally more in tune with their own emotions and the emotions of others.
Like some people just hardwired to be more sensitive to those emotional cues, huh?
It seems that way. But it's not all about personality or childhood either. Even stuff going on in your adult life can affect your empathy. Chronic stress, feeling emotionally overwhelmed, or even experiencing burnout from, say, a job where you're constantly dealing with other people's problems, that can all take a toll.
So basically, life can knock the empathy right out of you, huh?
It can, and then, yeah, there's always the possibility of some genetic factors at play, too. But it's never a simple answer. It's usually this complex mix of nature, nurture, and life experiences.
Right. So let's say you're in a relationship where empathy is lacking. What does that do to the relationship overall?
It's not good. I mean, communication falls apart. There are constant misunderstandings and fights because people aren't really listening to or trying to understand each other. And the person who's not getting empathy, well, they end up feeling isolated, lonely, and frustrated, even though they're in a relationship. It can really erode trust, too, and make intimacy almost impossible.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster, really.
It can be. The sources were pretty clear about that. They basically said a lack of empathy is one of the biggest red flags for a dysfunctional or even toxic relationship.
Toxic, wow. So I guess the big question is, can this be fixed? Can people learn to be more empathetic?
Here's the good news. Empathy isn't set in stone. It's not like you're born with a certain amount and that's it. It's more like a skill. You can learn it, you can practice it, and you can definitely improve it.
It's huge relief to hear.
It is. It means there's hope for people who are struggling with this. Now, therapy can be a huge help here. It gives couples a safe space to work on these skills and start to change those negative patterns. And there are all sorts of exercises they can do, like active listening, perspective taking, and learning to validate each other's emotions.
So it's not just about like trying harder to be nice. It's about learning specific techniques and practicing them.
Right, and one of the most important things is creating a sense of safety and security in the relationship. If someone doesn't feel safe, they're not going to let their guard down enough to be empathetic. So that's often the first step.
That's so interesting. It's like empathy requires vulnerability and vulnerability requires safety.
Exactly. It's all connected.
Okay, so we've talked about these three challenges: isolation, pride, and lack of empathy. And we've touched on some strategies for change, but I'm curious, what does this look like in actual therapy? What are some of uh, the proven approaches therapists use to help couples work through these issues?
Well, the sources highlighted a few major approaches that have a lot of research backing them up. Emotionally focused therapy, EFT, the Gottman method, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and, well, the psychodynamic approaches. Each one comes from a different perspective and uses different techniques, but they all have the same goal: helping couples build healthier relationships.
Let's break those down a little, starting with EFT, emotionally focused therapy. I know we've mentioned it a bit already, but what's the basic idea behind it?
EFT is all about attachment. It looks at adult love as, well, as kind of an extension of the bond between a parent and a child. And it sees the problems couples have as stemming from, these negative patterns of interacting, these cycles that keep them from feeling safe and connected. The goal of EFT is to help couples break those negative cycles and build a more secure bond.
Sounds a bit like what we were talking about earlier with the isolation and the lack of empathy kind of feeding off each other, creating that negative cycle.
Exactly. And EFT is all about interrupting that cycle, helping couples understand their needs and learn how to meet them in a healthier way.
So how does that actually happen? What does EFT look like in practice?
Well, usually therapy goes through 3 stages. First, there's de-escalation. This is where the therapist helps the couple calm things down, reduce the conflict, and start to understand the negative cycle they're stuck in. Then they move on to restructuring. Here, the focus is on helping couples change those unhealthy patterns of interacting. They learn how to communicate better, be more vulnerable with each other, and respond to each other's needs in a more empathetic way.
Okay, so first calm the storm, then rebuild.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And then the last stage is consolidation. This is where they, really solidify those new patterns, make them part of their everyday relationship. EFT uses a lot of different techniques to help couples through this process. Things like active listening, reflecting emotions, asking thought-provoking questions, reframing problems, and even doing some role-playing in session to practice new ways of interacting.
So it's very hands-on, very interactive, not just sitting around talking about your feelings.
Right. And the best part is that there's tons of research showing that EFT actually works. It's really effective at reducing distress in couples and helping them build stronger, more satisfying relationships.
Okay, that's good to know. So what about the Gottman method? I know that's another big one in couples
Oh,
therapy.
yeah, the Gottman method. This one is all about, well, about using research to guide therapy. It's based on decades of studying couples, figuring out what makes relationships work and what predicts divorce. They've got this framework called the Sound Relationship House. It's like a blueprint for a healthy relationship with different levels that all build on each other.
Like levels of what?
Well, things like building love maps, sharing fondness and admiration, turning towards each other, having a positive perspective, managing conflict effectively, making each other's dreams come true, and creating shared meaning. And all of that is built on a foundation of trust and commitment.
That's quite a house. Sounds pretty comprehensive.
It is. And the Gottman method is really good at giving couples practical tools to work with. They do a lot of assessments to figure out where the couple's strengths and weaknesses are, and then they teach them specific skills to address those areas.
So less about digging into the past and more about uh, learning practical skills for the present, right?
Exactly. It's very focused on the here and now. And it's really good at helping couples improve their communication, handle conflict better, and build that sense of friendship and intimacy that's so important in a relationship.
So how would they approach the issues we've been talking about, the isolation, the pride, the lack of empathy?
Well, they'd probably look at emotional withdrawal as a sign of, a flooding. That's like when someone gets so overwhelmed during a conflict that they just shut down. And for pride and defensiveness, they've got these specific antidotes to the four horsemen, which are, those really destructive communication patterns that can poison a relationship. And for empathy, they emphasize building those love maps we talked about, getting to really know your partner's inner world. And of course, they work on active listening, validation, and that whole idea of turning towards each other's bids for connection.
Turning towards, that's a big one in the Gottman method, isn't it?
It is. It's all about those little moments where you choose to engage with your partner, show them you care instead of, just brushing them off. And like EFT, the Gottman method has tons of research backing it up. It's been proven to be super effective at helping couples build lasting, happy relationships.
Okay, so we've got EFT, the Gottman method. What about CBT? I know that's a really popular approach for all sorts of mental health issues.
CBT, yeah, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's all about understanding how your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all connected. In couples therapy, CBT focuses on identifying those negative patterns of thinking and acting that are causing problems in the relationship, and then, changing them.
So it's all about like retraining your brain,
Yeah,
right?
much. They use a lot of different techniques. Cognitive restructuring helps you challenge those unhelpful thoughts. Communication skills training helps you talk to each other more effectively. Problem-solving training teaches you how to work through conflicts without blowing up. And then there's IBCT, Integrative Behavioral Couple Therapy. That's like a more modern version of CBT for couples. It puts a lot of emphasis on acceptance, learning to accept the things about your partner that you can't change.
Acceptance. It's got to be tough sometimes, right?
It can be, but it's also incredibly freeing because it helps you let go of those unrealistic expectations and focus on what you can actually control, your own thoughts, feelings, and actions.
And how would CBT approach these issues of pride, isolation, and empathy?
Well, for pride and defensiveness, it would be all about identifying those underlying beliefs that fuel those reactions, like I always have to be right, or showing weakness is dangerous. And then it would help them challenge those beliefs and develop more balanced and realistic ones. For emotional isolation, it would focus on improving communication skills and encouraging couples to engage in more activities together, to build that connection. And for lack of empathy, it would help them challenge those negative assumptions they make about their partner's intentions and encourage them to see things from different perspectives.
Sounds very practical, very action-oriented.
It is, and it works. CBT has a ton of research behind it showing that it's really effective at helping people change their thinking and behavior.
And what about the psychodynamic approaches? I know those are a bit more, uh, I guess, deep diving into the past.
Yeah, the psychodynamic approaches, those are all about, well, about understanding how your past experiences, especially your early relationships, shape how you relate to others as an adult. It's like those early patterns get replayed in your current relationships, even if you're not aware of it.
So it's like your childhood is always with you, even if it's in the background.
Exactly. And psychodynamic therapy helps you bring those unconscious patterns into the light, understand them, and, well, hopefully change them.
Okay, so how would that apply to these issues we've been talking about?
Well, it could be really helpful in understanding the roots of emotional isolation. Like maybe someone learned to shut down emotionally because that was the only way to survive a chaotic or neglectful childhood. Or it could shed light on why someone is so wrapped up in pride. Maybe it's a defense against deep-seated feelings of shame that go way back.
Huh.
And for lack of empathy, it could help explore those early experiences that might have led to difficulties in understanding and connecting with others.
It's fascinating how much our past can affect our present, even without us realizing it.
It is. And the cool thing is that even though all these approaches are different, they can actually complement each other really well.
So it's not about picking the right approach. It's more about finding I guess, the right combination of approaches for each couple.
Right, exactly. A good therapist will pull from different approaches based on what the couple needs. There's no one-size-fits-all solution here.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the challenges, the different therapy approaches, and the whole idea of empathy and how important it is. So what are the big takeaways? If a couple is struggling with these issues, what are the key things they need to focus on?
Well, there are a few things that come up again and again, no matter what approach you're talking about. First off, you got to break those negative cycles, those patterns of interacting that are just making things worse.
Okay, interrupt the pattern. What else?
Emotional awareness is huge. Both partners need to be able to tune into their own feelings and learn how to express them in a healthy way. And that goes hand in hand with vulnerability. Being able to let your guard down, show your partner who you really are, that's essential for building real intimacy.
But that's scary, isn't it? Letting
Well,
someone see your messy bits.
it is, but it's also the only way to truly connect. And that's where empathy comes in. Learning to understand and validate your partner's feelings, even when you don't agree with them, that's how you create a safe space for that vulnerability.
Safety, that seems to be a recurring theme here.
It's crucial. You can't have intimacy without safety. And of course, communication skills are key. Learning how to express yourself clearly, listen without judgment, and work through conflicts constructively.
So basically, it's about learning a whole new way of relating to each other.
It can be, and it takes work, but it's definitely worth it.
So let's say a couple decides to do the work. They go to therapy, they try all these strategies. What are some of the roadblocks they might hit?
Oh, there are definitely challenges along the way. Sometimes one partner just isn't as motivated as the other, or there might be a lot of baggage from the past, trust issues that make it hard to open up. And sometimes people just have a hard time putting those new skills into practice in the heat of the moment.
It's one thing to talk about it in therapy. It's another thing to actually do it when you're in the middle of a fight.
Exactly. And sometimes there are other issues going on too. Individual mental health problems can definitely make it harder to work on relationship stuff.
It's like you got to be able to take care of yourself before you can really show up for someone else.
Right. And then, sometimes life just throws you curveballs. Stress at work, family problems, financial worries, all that can add fuel to the fire.
So it's not just about what's going on inside the relationship. It's about the whole context of their lives.
It is. It's all interconnected. And sometimes, there's a limit to how much empathy someone can develop, especially if they have a personality disorder that really impairs their ability to connect with others.
So not all relationships can be saved.
Unfortunately not. But even when there are those kinds of limitations, therapy can still help couples find ways to manage those differences and create a more functional relationship.